Inside the United States Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Candace Owens clash in a nationally televised hearing over one of the most explosive debates in modern America. Is Black Lives Matter a cry for justice, or the greatest racial hoax in U.S. history? Candace strikes first, armed with carefully selected data and financial scandals, aiming to expose BLM as a calculated political fraud. But just minutes later, Jasmine blows the room wide open with evidence so undeniable, even the silence becomes a statement. If we destroy the movement meant to protect Black lives, who will protect us when the next body drops? Inside the echoing halls of the Capitol, the hearing room of the House Judiciary Committee had never felt more like a battlefield. Bright floodlights lined the back wall for the live broadcast, and every major network anchor was in place. This wasn't just another oversight hearing. This was war over a movement that had shaken the soul of the nation. The title on every printed placard read in bold, "Reassessing the Impact and Financial Transparency of the Black Lives Matter Movement." But beneath the formality was something sharper, an unspoken verdict being written before a word was even said. When Candace Owens stepped into the chamber, the cameras turned like soldiers following their commander. Dressed in flawless ivory, her stride was crisp, chin high, smile calculated. She waved to reporters like a politician, not a witness, and even cracked a joke to the chairman. The Republican bench welcomed her with nods, and just beyond them, sitting silent and surrounded by murmurs, was Jasmine Crockett. No entourage, no smirk, just stillness and a stare that didn't blink. Jasmine's suit was plain black. No flash, no designer, no signal, just war paint and cloth. Her hands were folded in her lap, motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything. There were no pre-show interviews, no backroom greetings, no smiling for the cameras. Because Jasmine knew something Candace didn't, that this wasn't her stage, it was a trap. One where the weight of every protest, every life lost, every shot fired unjustly had found its way into this room and landed in her chest. Meanwhile, across America, the moment unfolded like a movie trailer. In barbershops and courtrooms, classrooms and jail cells, millions tuned in, some praying, some judging, some laughing. "She's not ready for Candace," a popular podcast host had sneered the night before. "Crockett's too soft. Owens is going to eat her alive." But Jasmine didn't flinch. Because the thing about silence, it isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the sound of a blade being sharpened. And then, just as the room had begun to settle into the weight of Jasmine's silence, Candace Owens rose like a storm dressed in white, armed not with empathy, but with evidence and edge, as if she hadn't come to testify, but to expose. Her voice didn't tremble. It was smooth, sharp, and unmistakably deliberate, every syllable shaped like a warning shot. "Let me make one thing clear, because no one else here will. Black Lives Matter does not represent Black people. It uses them." The words struck with brutal clarity, clearing the air like lightning before thunder. The room tensed. Some leaned in, others recoiled. Jasmine didn't move. Candace reached for a binder already open on her table, a black leather folder lined with color-coded tabs and yellow highlights. She lifted it like a weapon, turned the first page, and continued. $6 million. That's what was spent on a single mansion in Los Angeles. Donated money, given in the name of justice, now poured into oceanfront wine cellars and private studio rooms. The screen behind her lit up with an image of the property, a luxurious modern home with high glass walls, infinity pools, and panoramic views of the California coast. Below the photo, in bold red letters, "Purchased by BLM Holdings, Inc." Candace let the moment sink in. Then turning the page, she listed names, family members, friends, associates of BLM leaders, people paid with no public job descriptions, receiving consulting fees that rivaled salaries of doctors and lawyers. Patrice Culler's brother, hired for security at $840,000. No prior experience, no documentation of duties, no audits, just trust. She paused, letting the microphone carry the silence. Then she drove deeper. While mothers of the fallen begged for burial costs, leadership was negotiating studio deals and TikTok content houses. There were no raised voices, no drama, just a steady, cold dissection of what she described as betrayal. Betrayal not by outsiders, but from within the very movement meant to protect. Her voice tightened. BLM had the world's attention, the moral high ground, and it sold it for property portfolios and photo ops. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Even some Democratic aides glanced down awkwardly. Jasmine hadn't flinched, but the pressure in the room was changing, pulling public sympathy away from her, toward the narrative Candace was building, brick by damning brick. And then came the line, the one designed to shatter the illusion. BLM isn't a movement, Candace said slowly, locking eyes with Jasmine. It's a corporate entity masquerading as a moral crusade. It is a brand. It is political theater. And it is time that this country stops pretending it's anything else. Gasps didn't come, just silence. Thick, suspicious, watching, waiting. For a brief moment, it felt like Candace had done it, flipped the script, turned the grief into greed, turned the movement into a mask. And at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, still silent, still staring forward, but no longer invisible. Because now she wasn't just a witness. She was the only one left standing between a movement and its collapse. The last word had barely left Candace's mouth when the weight of her performance settled over the room like a thick, bitter fog. And in that moment, it felt as if the verdict had already been written. Heads nodded. Not all, but enough. A low rumble of agreement swept through the Republican seats like the first signs of a gathering storm. One congressman leaned back with a smirk, arms folded in smug satisfaction. Another tapped his pen twice, then offered a subtle clap. Too quiet for the cameras, but loud enough to send a message. The air was no longer neutral, it was tilted. Tilted toward the woman in white who had just accused an entire movement of fraud and rot. And Candace knew it. She fed on it. With precise, deliberate grace, she leaned forward across her microphone, not to address the committee, but to aim a shot at the woman seated directly across from her. Her voice dropped into something lower, more intimate, almost theatrical in cruelty. If you came here, Ms. Crockett, to defend a cult built on deceit, you should have brought more than memories and tears. The words didn't land like an insult. They landed like a knife, quiet, sharp, personal. Jasmine didn't blink, but something in the room shifted. A few aides looked away. One Democratic staffer exhaled slowly, hands clenched in their lap. Candace sat back, satisfied. She hadn't just accused Jasmine of being wrong. She'd accused her of being naive, unprepared, sentimental. In a room where facts had been weaponized and emotion had been painted as weakness, Candace had just declared open season on pain itself. And the world was watching. Candace's words still lingered in the air, sharp and cruel, when Jasmine finally looked up, not with anger, not with panic, but with the quiet, unshakable resolve of someone who had already walked through fire and come out carrying names the world had tried to forget. She didn't rush. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like someone standing not in front of microphones but at the edge of a grave. The silence around her thickened, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill space, it drowns it. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, firm, without a trace of tremble, and every syllable felt as if it had been carried from a place deeper than politics could reach. I've held Breonna Taylor's mother while she screamed into my shoulder because her daughter was shot 8 times in her sleep. The room didn't move. I've pulled a 10-year-old's body out of a blood-stained driveway while his cousins stood behind yellow tape, asking why nobody came for him sooner. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just said it. And because she didn't dramatize it, it hit even harder. You could hear the air-conditioned vents humming. You could hear someone's pen fall and clatter off a folder. Because for the first time that day, no one was thinking about bank statements or brand image. They were thinking about a child's body and a mother's scream. Jasmine let that image hang there, unchallenged, and then, with a tone like a final sentence being carved into stone, she said, BLM wasn't born in an office. It wasn't drafted by consultants. It wasn't trademarked. It rose out of the blood pooling around bodies on hot pavement while this country turned its face away. Her voice didn't rise, but it filled every corner of the room. Not with noise, but with truth. Not one built on spreadsheets, but on sirens and silence and the sound of shoes left behind after chalk outlines were drawn. and she wasn't finished. But in that moment, before any documents, before any evidence, the ground began to shift. Because the woman they said would be swallowed was still standing. The room had gone still under the weight of Jasmine's words. Raw, unfiltered, human. But just as that silence began to mean something, Candace Owens broke it with a smile, not of empathy, but of strategy. It was a smile that said, "I'm not moved." A smile that belonged more to a chessboard than a courtroom. Candace leaned slightly forward in her chair, fingers interlaced, head tilted like a surgeon studying the exact spot to cut. Her lips parted, not with compassion, but with calculation. And she spoke in a tone colder than the marble floors beneath their feet. "That was touching, truly. But tears," she said, pausing just long enough to let the cameras catch her expression, "are not policy." The sentence fell like glass breaking in slow motion. Not loud, not dramatic, just sharp. Her voice didn't rise because it didn't have to. It was the kind of quiet that sucks the air out of a room. She wasn't arguing facts. She was dismissing pain, reducing a mother's scream and a child's body to background noise in a debate. Her delivery wasn't angry. It was clinical. The smirk remained. Her eyes never blinked. And in that moment, it was clear. Candace wasn't just countering Jasmine's testimony. She was undermining the legitimacy of grief itself. To her, emotion was a flaw, mourning was a strategy, and justice was a ledger. A few nods rippled down the Republican row. A staffer smirked and tapped something on their phone. The hearing room, once heavy with memory, began to feel like a courtroom built to punish the wounded for bleeding. Jasmine didn't speak, not yet, but the injustice had shifted. It no longer sat in the numbers. It sat in the gaze of a woman who had just told the country that trauma had no standing. The silence in the chamber was loud now, louder than Candace's smirk, louder than her mockery, louder even than the sting of her words. Tears are not policy. But as that silence coiled through the room like smoke after a fire, Jasmine Crockett did not sit in it. She rose. There was no dramatic flair in her motion, no fist slammed on wood, no rustling of paper, no flash of righteous fury. She simply stood, slowly, unflinchingly, like someone who had stood before injustice so many times, she no longer needed permission to speak. Her hands didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. Her stillness had weight, like a monument that had outlasted storms. And then she looked up. Her eyes didn't scan for allies. She didn't try to gauge the room. She knew what it thought. She felt what it had already begun to assume, that this battle was tilting, that Candace had landed a clean shot. But Jasmine wasn't here for debate points. She wasn't here to match rhetoric. She was here because someone had to carry the line between a slogan on a banner and a scream in the street. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was firm. It didn't quake. It didn't beg. It declared, "The Black Lives Matter global network is not the same as the Black Lives Matter movement." That first sentence landed like a gavel. Clean, final, non-negotiable. Millions of people took to the streets not because of a nonprofit, but because of a knee on a neck, because of a mother sobbing into a pillow, because of verdicts that came with no justice and deaths that came with no explanation. Her words came slow, measured, but each one carried the weight of someone who had memorized the sound of anguish. She didn't reference footnotes, she referenced funerals. She didn't hold up reports, she held up memory. If someone mismanages a foundation, she continued, you investigate the foundation. You hold them accountable. That's the rule of law. But if someone betrays a principle, you don't abandon the principle. You fight for it harder. There was no flourish to it, no poetry, just truth sharpened down to its most essential edge. Then she paused, letting her breath steady, not because she needed to recover, but because the room needed to catch up. And when she resumed, her tone changed, not louder but colder, clearer, aimed. "Let me ask you this," she said, turning slightly toward Candace, who was now listening with that same half-smile frozen in place. "When the Catholic Church faced its darkest scandals, when predators hid behind pulpits, did you tear down cathedrals? Did you burn the Bible? Did you call the faith itself a fraud?" There was a shift, a physical one. A couple senators stirred uncomfortably in their chairs. One aide glanced up at the ceiling like he needed to reset his focus. Jasmine didn't flinch. Number U separated the abuse from the belief, because even in failure, faith has meaning, and so does this movement. Her voice dipped, not in volume, but in force. It grew heavier, denser, more intimate. BLM was not built in a boardroom. It was not born from a balance sheet. It came from something uglier, something older. It came from a sidewalk stained with blood, from a cell phone recording a man saying, "I can't breathe," as the world watched and did nothing. Every word was a counter to the cold calculus of Candace's narrative. Jasmine wasn't denying the financial mismanagement. She wasn't defending every decision ever made by a BLM executive. She was doing something far more dangerous to the other side. She was reclaiming the soul of the movement they were trying to bury beneath headlines and accounting ledgers. Black Lives Matter is not a tax ID number. It is not a trademark. It is not a scandal you can wrap in a segment and throw on cable news. It is a cry, a human cry, from morgues, from police stations, from mothers who have to pick out coffins smaller than their kitchen table. Her voice did not crack, but it strained, not from emotion, but from pressure, from the effort of holding up a truth that too many people were eager to collapse under a spreadsheet. And if that cry makes you uncomfortable, good, it should, because it means you're hearing it. Someone coughed. A paper shifted. The room hadn't burst, but it had bent. The smugness on the Republican bench didn't vanish, but it wavered. For the first time since the hearing began, the balance was no longer in Candace's favor. Jasmine glanced down at her hands, not to find notes, but to find steadiness in the moment. Then she looked up again, straight ahead now, not at Candace, not at the chairman, but at the cameras. We can investigate the money. We should. Transparency matters. But let's not pretend the real scandal is a house in LA. The real scandal is that we need a movement like Black Lives Matter at all. There it was, the shift, the slow turning of the tide. Because in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just defending a movement. She was indicting a system, not just with facts, but with meaning. And then came the line, the one the headlines would quote, the one the room would feel even after the lights were gone. BLM is not perfect, but it's not the enemy. It is what rises when people have nowhere else to stand. The oxygen in the chamber seemed to stretch thinner. Jasmine didn't ask for applause. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She let her words sit, like names etched into stone. Unapologetic, uncompromised. She remained standing for a moment longer, not out of defiance, but out of duty. She had said what needed to be said, not for the committee, not for Candace, but for every person watching from a living room in Milwaukee or a prison cell in Georgia or a classroom in Baltimore. People who didn't need another debate. They needed someone to see them and say it out loud. And when she finally sat down, she didn't break eye contact with the room. She sat like a woman who had carried something heavy and finally placed it in front of the world and dared it to look away. The room had swayed, no, cracked, under the gravity of Jasmine Crockett's truth. For a moment, even the most hardened skeptics had felt the tremble. But Candace Owens didn't deal in trembles. She waited, not with nervous anticipation, but with surgical patience. And when the timing was perfect, when the emotional dust still lingered in the air, she struck again. No transition, no warning, just a subtle flick of her finger across a digital tablet, and the hearing room transformed. The screen behind her lit up, but this time it wasn't spreadsheets or tax documents. It was raw footage, unfiltered, loud. Flames consuming a police cruiser, protesters shouting, a gloved fist slamming the windshield of a squad car until the glass gave way and collapsed inward like bone. One voice, distorted by distance and adrenaline, screamed, "Burn it all down!" A few people in the room flinched. The clip was less than 30 seconds long, but it didn't need more time. Its impact was calibrated, precision edited to amplify chaos. And Candace, never missing a beat, stepped back into the glow of the monitor, her silhouette calm and composed. "Philadelphia, June 1st, 2020, she said coolly. "That officer, a father of three, suffered second-degree burns to his hands and face. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply stated, letting the images and facts do what emotion never could in this room. Stick. The screen faded to black, but the silence it left behind felt louder than the screams had. Then came slide 2. It was a tweet. Simple, white on black. A public quote from a former BLM chapter leader. Dated, verified, and now weaponized. The words were boxed in red, bold, undeniable. We were told to shut up and stop asking where the money went. We weren't allowed to demand transparency. That's not a movement. It's a monopoly on pain. There was no commentary. Just that. Candace waited. Let it burn. She stepped forward, slowly, and took her seat again, smoothing the front of her blazer with calculated precision. She didn't look at Jasmine, not yet. First, she let her gaze pass over the committee, pausing deliberately on each face, reading them like a lawyer sizing up a jury. And then, without raising her voice, she delivered the blow. I'm not here to tear down the idea of justice. I'm here to confront what was done in its name. A slight pause, a shift in her tone, not louder but lower, sharper. We were told BLM stood for hope, for change, for accountability. But what do you call it when the fires rage, the dollars vanish, and the truth is muzzled by loyalty? Now she turned her eyes toward Jasmine, not hostile, but heavy, cold, inevitable. I don't judge the idea, she said. I judge the outcome. That sentence was quiet, but it landed like a verdict, the kind that closes courtroom doors. There was no immediate rebuttal, no protest, just stillness, a kind that felt unnatural, a kind that meant something had just shifted. Again. The emotional momentum Jasmine had earned was now tangled in broken glass and Twitter quotes. Jasmine Crockett did not speak. She did not stand. Her shoulders didn't slump, but they no longer leaned forward. Her eyes dropped briefly, not in surrender, but in calculation, in pain, in the cruel arithmetic of public perception. It was the blink of a moment, but that was all Candace needed. The room took it in and interpreted it as weakness. A Republican congressman 2 rows back let out an audible exhale through his nose, a smug, almost satisfied sound. One aide glanced at another and exchanged the tiniest nod. Even the chair leaned forward slightly as if preparing to pivot. The camera feed, broadcast across millions of screens, now focused not on facts, but on face. Jasmine's silence, Jasmine's breath, Jasmine's pause. Because this was no longer about numbers or fire or grief, it was about control. And in that moment, Candace Owens had taken it back. She didn't grin. She didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands on the desk as if she'd merely filed paperwork. But underneath the stillness, everyone could feel it. Her precision, her intention, the force of a person who knew exactly when to use fire and when to suffocate it with frost. Jasmine had delivered the weight of the dead, but Candace had delivered the footage. Jasmine had evoked truth, but Candace had brought the backlash. And for now, for this single shuddering beat, Candace Owens had the room again. Just as the tide seemed to tilt away from her, as the oxygen thickened with doubt and the room began folding itself around Candace's controlled narrative, Jasmine Crockett moved, not urgently, not reactively, but with the precision of someone who had waited for this moment. Her hand slipped calmly into the inner pocket of her blazer. No words, no preface, just a simple motion, controlled, intentional, quiet. She drew out her phone, unlocked the screen with her thumb, and tapped once. Somewhere behind her, a technician caught the cue. A faint chime broke the silence. The massive screen on the hearing room wall lit up, suddenly, blindingly, and what appeared wasn't a headline or a chart. It wasn't commentary or opinion. It was surveillance footage, time-stamped, grayscale, grainy, brutally real. The room shifted. Everyone sat back up. On screen, a quiet residential street in southern Alabama. Mid-afternoon, a 16-year-old black boy in a gray hoodie standing alone at the end of a driveway, his hands clearly raised. A police cruiser swerved into frame. Doors open. Commands were shouted, but there was no audio. Just gestures, urgency, tension. The boy took one step back, then one more. And then suddenly, without physical provocation, without warning, a single muzzle flash lit the left edge of the screen. He dropped like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. The video didn't end there. The footage kept rolling, through the arrival of backup cars, through the chaotic choreography of body positioning and radio communication. Then at the 29-second mark, something changed. An officer stepped out of frame, then reappeared beneath the mounted street camera. Middle-aged, stocky, calm. He glanced upward, once, looked around, climbed onto the hood of his own cruiser, reached up with gloved hands and unplugged the power source. The video feed died. The screen froze on black. Not a single person in the chamber spoke. Not a cough, not a foot shuffle. Just a room suffocating on what it had just witnessed. Jasmine finally broke the silence. Her voice was low. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. The grief in her tone carried more weight than volume ever could. This footage was never shown to the boy's family. She waited, not dramatically, but out of reverence, for what she had just shown and what it meant. Then she tapped her phone again. The screen changed. Now, an internal email thread. Department of Public Safety, confidential. The subject line read plainly, RE:"Oak Ridge footage -June 13. 4 names on the thread. One reply highlighted in red. Jasmine zoomed in. No context, just one sentence. One wound. I think they deserved what they got. If they knew how to obey, they'd still be breathing. The air was punched out of the room, not by noise, but by the absence of any sound at all. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers frozen above the keys. A congressional aide dropped his pen and didn't bother to pick it up. The chairman leaned back slowly, his grip on the gavel momentarily forgotten. Candace Owens sat motionless, her hands still clasped neatly on the table, her expression unreadable, but utterly still. No note flipping, no rebuttal forming, just silence. Jasmine remained standing. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't seek reaction, because the footage spoke louder than any defense, because the words on that screen didn't need commentary, because this wasn't strategy, it was evidence. And the truth it carried couldn't be debated. It could only be faced. Off to the left, in the corner where media cameras and reporters sat crammed shoulder to shoulder, a man in his late 30s wearing a press badge whispered into his mic. Barely audible, but perfectly timed. That wasn't a counter-argument. That was a bomb under the foundation. For years, people had talked about shifting narratives, about changing tides. But this wasn't just a shift. This was a rupture. Because in less than 60 seconds, Jasmine Crockett had done something no speech could. She had made the room feel the cost. And for the first time all morning, no one, not even Candace Owens, was ready to speak after her. The screen had gone dark. The footage was over. The email thread gone. But its echo still haunted the chamber, reverberating in silence so dense, even the ceiling lights felt dimmer. Jasmine Crockett sat calm, composed, though her very stillness had become its own form of pressure. On the opposite end of the long table, Candace Owens exhaled, not in defeat, but in recalibration. No more documents, no more props. Now it was only voices. Only truth as each woman saw it, and the war between them was about to turn personal. Candace leaned in, her elbows now resting lightly on the desk. Her fingers interlaced, her chin dipped, eyes locked on Jasmine. The smile was gone, replaced by steel. Her voice, though steady, trembled with the restraint of someone who knew she was losing the audience, but not the argument. I stand for the truth, she said, even when it's ugly, especially then. The words were simple, almost noble in form, but behind them was something colder, an insistence that pain be processed like data, that injustice be clean enough to fit inside a spreadsheet. She let the sentence hang there, like something honorable, like something immutable. Because justice, she continued, isn't built on emotion. It's built on facts, on accountability, not crying, not storytelling, but truth. For a flicker of a second, the room teetered. Candace had found her ground again. Her tone didn't plead, it commanded. It sounded like reason. It sounded right, until Jasmine stood, not fast, not theatrically, just with the terrifying calm of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to carry. Her eyes didn't burn, but they didn't blink either. Her breath was even, her hands loose by her sides. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise above Candace's. It sank beneath it, grounded in something Candace's words could never touch. "You say you stand for the truth," Jasmine said, not looking down, not looking away. "But the truth you defend is money." She took a single step closer to the center of the dais, not toward Candace, but toward the middle of the space, toward the room itself, toward the audience, toward the camera. "It's figures in a column, dollar signs you think define morality, budget sheets you hold tighter than memory." There was no tremble in her tone, only heat, only weight. "But the truth I carry bleeds." A hush swept the chamber again, deeper than before. Jasmine didn't fill it with volume. She filled it with presence. "The truth I bring," she continued, "has names, has funerals, has screams under its skin. It wears the scent of smoke from burning vigils and the silence of children who will never graduate, never grow up, never come home again." She looked Candace in the eye then, not to attack, but to return the weight. "You say facts matter," she said, voice unwavering. "But tell me this. When was the last time you zipped up a body bag while a mother collapsed beside you? When was the last time you had to explain to a grandmother that no, there would be no trial, no footage, no justice, just a closed casket and a police report written in past tense?" The question hung like a verdict. Candace didn't respond, not because she had no words, but because none would have survived the truth just laid bare in front of her. And Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She stood still, her voice now softer, not in retreat, but in revelation. "You fight to protect law and order," she said. "I fight to make sure the law remembers we're human." The tension didn't break. It deepened. The chamber wasn't just watching anymore. It was witnessing. Two women, one courtroom, one cause, interpreted through two opposing realities. And for a moment, everyone felt it. One side stood on paper. The other stood on graves. Just as the air seemed to collapse under the weight of Jasmine's last words, she reached down, not with defiance but with ceremony. Her fingers brushed across a single sheet of paper. No color, no bullet points, just white, printed text. She lifted it with care, as if it were fragile. Not because it was thin, but because what it carried had been made invisible for too long. She stepped to the center of the table. No podium, no spotlight, just silence in the eyes of a nation watching, waiting, unsure of what came next. And then she said it, softly, not for shock, not for spectacle, but because some truths should only be spoken in the tone of mourning. "I would like to enter 41 names into the congressional record." She didn't explain them. She didn't contextualize them, because their existence was context enough. These are Black Americans killed by law enforcement over the past 5 years. Unarmed, unjustified, unanswered. Then she read, Jalen Lewis, 25, shot in the head during a traffic stop in Mississippi. His mother watched it from the passenger seat. Elijah McClain, 23, walked home from a corner store in Aurora, Colorado, choked until his heart stopped. He apologized while dying. Breonna Taylor, 26, asleep in her own bed, shot 6 times when officers raided the wrong apartment. Her voice did not shake, but it carried the tremble of every mother who could not stand there to speak for themselves. Antoine Rose Jr., 17, high school honor roll, shot in the back while running away holding no weapon. Adatiana Jefferson, 28, killed while babysitting her nephew. Police never knocked. Each name felt like a drum beat, measured, relentless, not rushed, not reduced. Each pause between names carved space for the weight of what was lost. Jonathan Price, Stephon Clark, Rakaya Boyd, Jordan Edwards, Detrick Griffin. A cough sounded from somewhere deep in the chamber, but no one moved. No one dared to interrupt what now felt less like testimony and more like ritual. A quiet act of resurrection, name by name, Jasmine continued. Christopher Whitfield, Jamie Johnson, Morris Gordon, Botham Jean. And then she stopped. Just for a moment. Not because she faltered, but because the next sentence would pierce too deep without breath. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, shot 2 seconds after officers arrived. The toy gun was orange-tipped. The room absorbed that one like it had absorbed nothing else. One senator removed his glasses and wiped his eyes without shame. A congressional aide buried their face behind a notepad. One woman from the media row put her phone down, because nothing she could tweet would be enough. Jasmine pressed on, calm, slow, not robotic, deliberate. Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Terrence Crutcher, Betty Jones, Freddie Gray. And suddenly what had been a debate between ideologies became something else entirely. Something the chamber wasn't built to hold. Remembrance. Kajiemi Powell, Tyree Davis, William Green, Miguel Richards, George Robinson, Vincent Truitt. She read each name like it was her own brother, like it was someone America had whispered about and then forgotten. But in that room, in that hour, they were not statistics. They were present. And finally, George Floyd, 46, Minneapolis, Minnesota, pinned to the pavement for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, said, "I can't breathe," 27 times. When the last name passed her lips, Jasmine did not sit. She didn't bow her head or close her eyes. She simply stood, as if holding the space those lives had left behind. The room said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. And in that silence, truth did what facts couldn't. It filled the air. It named the dead. It ended the argument. Even if only for a moment. The names had been spoken, each one a tolling bell in the heart of the chamber, and just as their echoes began to fade, Jasmine moved again, not to mourn this time, but to expose. She reached beneath the desk, pulled out a slender blue folder, unmarked, clean, and laid it flat before her. No hesitation, no explanation. Only motion with the unmistakable weight of purpose. Her fingers unclipped the fastener and spread out a sequence of pages. Receipts, memos, email printouts, and invoices. Each stamped, each signed, each dated. Jasmine raised her head, and this time her voice carried a new current. Not grief, not sorrow, but precision. The voice of a woman who had bled, then built a case. "I'd like to present documents obtained through independent investigation," she said calmly, detailing payments made by the Cordes Group, an ultra-conservative PR firm, between June 2020 and March 2023. She tapped the first page. Over $14.6 million in verified transactions, spent not on political candidates, not on legislation, but on dismantling one phrase, Black Lives Matter. The monitors lit up and the chamber turned into a courtroom. Exhibit after exhibit flashed across the screen. Project briefings marked disrupt urban sentiment. Emails with subject lines like dilution strategy for youth demographics and reduce visibility, BLM online search indexing. Jasmine didn't narrate every slide. She let the words damn themselves. One slide paused longer than the others. Partnership proposal, Cordes Group plus Stratanet Platforms, Meta Subdivision. Objective, suppress high engagement BLM content via algorithm modulation in key urban markets. Duration, 90 days, renewable. The room changed, physically. Some members shifted in their seats, others went completely still. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't soften. She stood taller, and then she said the part no one wanted entered into the record. This wasn't about opposing a political stance. This wasn't critique. This was sabotage, a multi-million-dollar operation designed to strip legitimacy from the most visible cry for justice in modern American history. She held up one printed memo. The camera zoomed in. Objective number 4, link BLM imagery with chaos, destruction, and Marxist language at every digital intersection. Jasmine turned toward the committee, then toward the cameras. Not as a witness now, but as a prosecutor. Fake think tanks, bot networks, funded influencers, and I have the paper trail to prove it. She paused, then slowly looked to her right, directly at Candace Owens. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with a question that cut deeper than either. And so I have to ask you, Miss Owens. The pause was surgical, measured, terrifying in its calm. If you say you stand against black people being manipulated, then why do you stand with the people who designed the system that's killing us one lie at a time? The question hit like a gavel cracking glass. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto Candace's and held them there. Not with rage, but with indictment. Candace said nothing, but her stillness betrayed the calculation behind her silence. She knew this wasn't an accusation, it was an unveiling. The screen behind Jasmine flipped again. A slide titled, Phase 2, Owens Collaboration Possibility? The bullet points weren't accusatory. They were strategic. Asset is telegenic, disciplined, already skeptical of BLM infrastructure. Recommend recruitment or indirect amplification through Echo Network. A quiet gasp escaped from the gallery. Jasmine didn't move. She let it breathe. You weren't just used, she said. You were selected. The sentence was not a slap. It was a mirror. One congressman dropped his pen. Another leaned back like a man realizing too late he'd built his house on sand. Still, Jasmine stood, her voice steady, her gaze unshaken. I've watched people die with no cameras around. I've watched mothers bury children while algorithms buried their stories. And while you were being raised up as a voice of contrarian truth, the people raising you were cashing checks soaked in silence. No one interrupted her. No one could. Jasmine tapped one final page, letting it rest on the screen behind her, a quote from a now-retired Cordis executive. It was dated, credible, verified. We didn't need to defeat the movement. We just needed to make enough people believe it never mattered. Then she turned to the committee, her voice a whisper now, but somehow louder than anything spoken that day. Truth is not what you survive on TV. It's what you're willing to say after everything else has been stripped away. She looked back at Candace one last time. So tell me, Miss Owens, do you stand against being used, or only when it's not convenient? No response came. None was safe. The silence that followed didn't belong to the chamber. It belonged to reckoning. And Jasmine just stood there silent, centered, and utterly unshakable, surrounded not by applause, but by the collapse of illusion. The hearing adjourned without applause, not because the room lacked reaction, but because every person present knew the noise would come later, and it would come from everywhere else. Within minutes of the session's close, Capitol Hill's marble corridors became electric veins pulsing with media crews. Boom mics swung like pendulums. Flash bulbs cracked like lightning. Headlines were being written before quotes were even finished. Across the street, a Fox News correspondent was already live, her voice slicing through the air like the edge of a blade. Tonight, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett showed just how dangerous emotion can be when left unchecked. Her performance, though impassioned, lacked intellectual discipline. This wasn't an argument. It was a eulogy masquerading as policy. The lower third on the screen read, Breaking, Crockett breaks down, no facts, just feelings. And yet, 2 blocks away inside the MSNBC newsroom, the tone was almost holy. The anchor, eyes glassy, spoke slowly, reverently. What we witnessed today wasn't political. It was prophetic. Jasmine Crockett didn't argue. She remembered. And in a room designed to forget, that's revolutionary. There's read, history spoken aloud. Jasmine Crockett and the voices of the dead. Twitter ignited like dry grass to a match. Within 30 minutes, hashtags were trending. Trudy Crockett was truth. Nah, your Owens destroyed. Nah, your BLM trial live. Nah, justice or just numbers. But the battlefield wasn't ideological anymore. It was visceral. In one thread, a viral conservative influencer posted Jasmine's tearless face with a caption that read, Emotion evidence. I'll take a spreadsheet over a sermon any day. Parcheri or Team Candace. It racked up over 40,000 retweets in an hour. But then came the response. A teacher from Atlanta reposted with the words, She didn't come to debate. She came to remember the dead. And if that bothers you more than how they died, then you're the problem. That reply alone hit 250,000 likes by sundown. TikTok flooded with remix edits. One looped Jasmine reading Elijah McClain's name over a beat so mournful it could have scored a war memorial. Another used her quote, "Truth you defend is money, truth I carry bleeds." Superimposed over black and white protest footage, news outlets began polling reactions live. CBS flash poll, viewer. Reaction, Jasmine Crockett came out stronger than expected. 68% Candace Owens delivered a sharper financial argument. 25%. Both lost credibility, 7%. But beyond stats and screens, something less visible had changed. Jasmine was now not just a congresswoman, not just a Democratic voice. She had become a vector, a lightning rod, a mirror held up to the machinery of spin, and for the first time, the camera didn't look away. The attacks came fast. One tabloid alleged a suspicious timing between Jasmine's evidence and unnamed tech insiders. Another ran with the headline, "Is Crockett coordinating with big tech to sway committee emotions?" But it didn't stick, not this time. Because the footage she showed wasn't doctored. The emails weren't fake. The names weren't invented. And the pain, raw, precise, unshaken, was impossible to unsee. A day later, 60 Minutes aired a special segment titled, "From Hashtag to Hearing, the New Face of Black Justice." And there she was, Jasmine, still, sharp, unapologetically composed. "You can call it emotion," she said in the interview, "but that emotion comes from funerals, from family members who have to raise their kids next to graves." Even late-night television couldn't avoid it. One host joked, "Candace showed up with an Excel file. Jasmine showed up with receipts, body counts, and God's silence." I know who won, but perhaps the moment of no return came from inside the Capitol itself. A Republican staffer, anonymous but verified, leaked a memo sent around conservative offices that evening. It read, "Reframe Crockett's remarks as emotional instability. Emphasize economic data. Do not allow the term recorded evidence to trend unchecked." But it was too late. It already had. Jasmine Crockett had done the one thing her critics feared most. She didn't shout. She didn't crumble. She commanded. And when the next morning's headlines settled into breakfast tables and news feeds, no one talked about the $6 million mansion Candace had opened with. No one mentioned the vandalism clip. What they remembered, what they felt, were 41 names, read aloud by a woman who hadn't come to win a debate. She had come to bury the lies. And as the sun set on Washington, D.C. that night, one truth remained, undeniable and dangerous to those who thought she could be dismissed. Jasmine Crockett had taken back the stage. Not with slogans, not with stats, but with memory, with presence, with blood. And the nation, divided as ever, could not look away. The moment before her final words stretched like the breath before a final verdict. Cameras steadied, pens hovered above paper. Even her harshest critics leaned forward, not to argue but to hear, because somewhere deep inside them, they knew she was about to tell the truth the room wasn't built to hold. Jasmine Crockett's hands remained on the lectern. No dramatics, no gesturing, only the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to name. Her voice was quiet, not broken, not boastful, just steady, as if every sentence was being carved into marble. "I won't stand here and pretend everything done under the name of Black Lives Matter was perfect." She looked to the left, then right, slowly, holding eye contact with the skeptics who'd spent hours trying to trap her in semantics. "I won't pretend money didn't go where it shouldn't have, that egos didn't grow bigger than movements, that some forgot what they were marching for." She breathed in, not as a pause, but as permission. "But I will say this. If the existence of failure means the erasure of purpose, then we'd better throw the whole of America into the garbage. Because failure isn't a stain on this nation. It's the blueprint it was built on." Gasps, audible ones. Not performative, not partisan, reflexive. She let the silence expand before stepping deeper. "You want to talk about misuse of funds? Fine. Let's talk about the trillions funneled into systems that jailed Black fathers for smelling like weed, but never jailed banks for stealing homes. Let's talk about the police departments with armored tanks but no working body cams. Let's talk about budgets that starve public schools while bloating prisons. She pointed, not to Candace, but to the wall behind her. You see that flag? That flag flew while my ancestors were whipped in the cotton fields. It flew while children were sold. While their mothers were told to stop crying, it'll happen again tomorrow. Now her voice dropped, quieter, deeper, like thunder too far away to dodge. So if you want me to abandon a movement because of where a few dollars went wrong, then you first explain to me how this country kept its flag flying while black bodies hung from trees. A journalist in the gallery dropped his pen. Another pressed her hand to her mouth. You talk about moral high ground while standing on bones. And you tell me my side needs to apologize? She turned her gaze, slow, deliberate, toward Candace Owens. You're not wrong to demand accountability, but ask yourself, why did you never demand it from the people who wrote the laws that made this oppression legal in the first place? Candace sat still, stone-faced, but her fingers twitched, just once. Jasmine took a final breath, one not born of exhaustion, but of completion. So I'll say this, clearly, so that every journalist, every lawmaker, every parent watching from home understands. She leaned into the mic, the world seemingly holding its breath with her. I do not defend corruption, but I will not let the sins of a few be weaponized to silence the screams of the many. The camera flashed to the screen behind her, still holding the quote from a Cordis Group memo. We don't need to defeat the movement, just make people doubt it existed for the right reasons. Jasmine pointed at it. That memo wasn't about policy, it was about erasure. She stared directly into the lens now, not at the committee, not at Candace, but at America. If you want to throw away a movement because one house was bought with dirty money, then tear down every church that ever hit a predator. Tear up every bill signed by a politician who owned slaves, and tear out every history book that skips over genocide like it was a footnote. She stepped back, just a little, her voice now no longer seeking approval, only reckoning. I am here because my ancestors could not be. I am speaking because they were denied the right, and I will not waste their suffering by allowing you to distort the justice they died waiting for. She glanced once more toward Candace, then finished. So if you think this whole thing should be tossed aside over imperfection, then toss America with it, because this nation was not born clean, it was born bleeding. For a heartbeat, the room held still, and then it detonated. The first to rise was a junior congresswoman, hands trembling, clapping slowly, tears unchecked. Then came another, and another. In seconds, the entire chamber was on its feet. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was sacred. It was grateful. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't smile, didn't wave. She stood there, a solitary figure in the storm she had not created, but had chosen to name, face first. Across the room, Candace Owens finally stood. Not in defiance, not in triumph. She gathered her notes, still pristine, but now lifeless. There were no more charts to show, no clips to play. The numbers had lost their teeth. She looked once at Jasmine, no words, no expression, and walked out. Not rushed, not humiliated, but finished. The cameras followed her until she crossed the threshold, but the focus remained behind, on the woman who hadn't come to win an argument. She had come to unearth a truth. The microphone in front of Jasmine still trembled, as if echoing her last words, even in absence. The press didn't interrupt. No one dared, because something unspoken now filled the room. Not a political victory, not a headline war, but the unmistakable sensation of witnessing justice spoken plainly. And for the first time in hours, no one wanted to speak over it, because the battle was over. And Jasmine Crockett, she had not just reclaimed the stage, she had redefined the terms of the war. As the last echoes of applause faded into stunned quiet, the room didn't just sit with Jasmine's words, it held them. They clung to the walls, to the floorboards, to the skin of every person who just heard truth spoken, not in slogans or sound bites, but in blood memory. And somewhere between the silence and the exit sign, the real question surfaced. Not about who won, but what now. Long after the cameras cut and the marble floor stopped reverberating with footsteps, the lesson left behind wasn't one of political strategy. It was human, brutal, honest. And it began with a truth few dared to speak. Not every story of justice begins with virtue, and not every movement survives perfection, but every act of dignity begins with remembering pain that was ignored too long. Jasmine hadn't come to rewrite a narrative. She came to reclaim one. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching, whether in Congress or in living rooms across America, that no society deserves peace if it builds that peace on the backs of the silent. Her victory was not in volume, but in vulnerability. While Candace presented numbers, Jasmine presented names. While others measured efficiency, she measured absence. She didn't just defend a movement, she redefined what it means to mourn publicly, with dignity. And perhaps most hauntingly, she taught everyone watching that some truths do not ask for applause. They demand reckoning. You don't have to believe in a hashtag to understand a mother's scream. You don't have to join a march to feel the tremble in a boy's last breath. That was the lesson. That pain, if endured in silence, becomes poison. That injustice, if calculated only in dollars, will never be uprooted. The hearing was never really about Black Lives Matter. That was the bait, the debate, the disguise. The real war was about narrative control, about who gets to define justice, about whether grief gets filtered through tax codes or listened to. And Jasmine's answer? Lived truth doesn't need your approval. It only needs to be heard. That's what made her dangerous to the structure. Not her politics, not her passion, but the fact that she didn't flinch when forced to tell America the truth about itself, that it punishes memory when it doesn't fit the mold, that it monetizes rebellion until it's profitable, then discards the remains. She stood for more than a cause. She stood for inheritance, the inheritance of rage, the inheritance of hope, the inheritance of being born into a fight you didn't start but cannot walk away from without betraying someone who died with your name in their mouth. And in that moment, the world watching didn't see a Democrat or a protester or a pundit. They saw what America never really learned how to face, a Black woman telling the truth without apology. That was the human lesson. That courage is not loud, it's persistent. That justice is not flawless, it's earned through scars. That memory isn't weakness, it's the only thing stronger than money. Jasmine's final words weren't about BLM's budget. They were about America's soul. And when she said, if you want to throw away a movement for its flaws, then throw away the country that forced us to build it, she wasn't being poetic. She was being precise. She was saying, don't you dare dissect our outrage while ignoring what made us scream. And there's something else the room learned. Maybe not out loud, but quietly, deeply, where conviction grows. That history does not need permission to repeat. It only needs silence. Candace Owens may have walked out, but the system she defended remained seated, shaken but intact, still dangerous, still calculating. And Jasmine knew that. She knew this wasn't the end. That truth, once spoken, doesn't end battles. It starts better ones. And for every child watching who saw their pain dismissed on cable news, for every student who saw their identity debated like a case file, for every mother still waiting for a knock on the door that doesn't come with a body bag, Jasmine Crockett became more than a voice. She became proof. Proof that dignity doesn't need perfect math. Proof that grief, when named aloud, becomes weapon and shield. Proof that being loud for the right reasons will always be more dangerous than being quiet for the wrong ones. But even as the weight of truth settled into the bones of the room, one question remained, burning like a brand behind every tear, every silence, every shaken breath. What now? What does a nation do after its reflection no longer flatters but accuses? What do we do when neutrality has become complicity? When the silence of the crowd screams louder than the voice of the fallen? This is not the moment to be impressed by Jasmine Crockett's courage. It is the moment to match it. Because justice, real, brutal, necessary justice, doesn't begin with applause in a marble chamber. It begins with what you choose to do once the screens go black and the hashtags fade. If you felt something when she spoke, that's not enough. Feeling is the beginning, but action, sustained, public, uncomfortable action, is the only proof you heard her at all. You don't need to be a lawmaker to hold the line. You don't need to be a lawyer to demand the truth. What you need is conviction, the kind that wakes you up at 3 a.m., the kind that whispers in your ear every time you scroll past another name, another face, another body left in the street. Don't post it if you won't fight for it. Don't quote it if you won't challenge the systems that made it necessary. Don't say, "I believe her," if you sit silent when she's attacked for speaking. Candace may have left the room, but the war she defended is still at your doorstep, and it doesn't knock politely. It barges in, badge in hand, and asks for your silence. Say no. Say it with your voice. Say it with your vote. Say it with your presence in rooms that were built to forget you. Because the next hearing won't be televised. The next injustice won't have a mic. The next Jasmine may not survive the silence. There are 3 things you must do, and you must do them now. Not next year, not when it's safe, not when it's trending. First, protect the truth. This system doesn't fear confrontation. It fears memory. It fears a people who can name the lives lost, the policies passed, the judges bought. So protect the truth like it's a body, because it is. Misinformation doesn't just distort, it disarms. It makes us believe our rage is irrational and our grief exaggerated. Don't let them shrink the pain. Don't let them bury it beneath bureaucracy. Speak it, share it, repeat it, until even those who refuse to listen have nowhere left to hide. Second, interrupt the comfort. America doesn't need more civility. It needs disruption. It needs people who are willing to be inconvenient at the dinner table, at the board meeting, at the ballot box. If your comfort comes at the cost of someone else's breath, then it's not peace. It's quiet genocide. Be the person who ruins someone's apathy. Be the reason someone has to rethink what they thought they knew. Because if you're not willing to break the illusion, then you're helping maintain the lie. Third, choose the side that bleeds. There are only 2 sides, one that holds the power and one that pays the price. You don't get to float between them, neutral and untouchable. Every dollar you spend, every vote you cast, every silence you keep, they all pick a side. So choose the one that bleeds. Stand with the ones who are still counting their dead. Stand with the ones who don't get the benefit of doubt or the luxury of revisionist history. Stand with the side that doesn't have PR firms, just funeral programs. Because this is the truth no one wants to admit. Justice doesn't come when the powerful change their minds. It comes when the powerless change the rules. Jasmine didn't win today because she convinced everyone. She won because she refused to yield to a lie. That's your job now. To refuse, to resist, to remember. This is not about guilt. Guilt is useless if it doesn't become strategy. This is about clarity. Clarity that the country you love is sick, and no amount of pledges or anthems will cure it. The only medicine is accountability. And the only way accountability lives is if you refuse to forget. If you're a teacher, teach the names no textbook includes. If you're a parent, raise children who question authority, not worship it. If you're an artist, create work they can't ignore. If you're a leader, risk your platform for someone else's dignity. If you're nobody with nothing but a voice, use it anyway, especially then. Because the future is not waiting, it's watching. They will try to rewrite today. They will clip Jasmine's words, twist her meaning, say she was too emotional or not solution-oriented. But history remembers what cowards erase. And today you saw the truth before it was sanitized, before it was filtered, before it was replaced by statistics that make murder feel like math. Don't forget how it felt, the breathlessness of her delivery, the crack in her voice when she said, "If you throw away the movement, throw away America too." The silence after she finished, the kind that only comes when the soul recognizes itself in someone else's pain. That is what you fight for now. You fight so the next Black mother doesn't need to beg for footage. You fight so the next name doesn't become a headline. You fight so that accountability isn't a hashtag, but policy, law, practice. You fight so that when your children ask where you stood, you don't have to lie. And if you still feel unsure, good. That means you're awake. Good revolutions don't begin with confidence. They begin with discomfort, with a trembling voice, with a single step. Take it. Because the worst thing you can do after hearing Jasmine Crockett speak is clap and then move on. This is not a performance. It's a call. And now that you've heard it, you don't get to pretend you didn't. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.